what I have been working on is a book about moving beyond coercive capacity. This is a book that's about India and Nepal, and the data that underpin the book come out of the border region between the south, the Terai in Nepal, and Bihar. So what I'm hoping to suggest to you today, and this is the perfect panel on which to do so, is that collaboration between legislators and bureaucrats can produce some really fantastic results, especially when they do so in such a way that they increase the legal knowledge of the general population. When people are aware of the rules and regulations that they are supposed to abide by, many of them will actually voluntarily comply with those rules without any coercion. This was the finding of the project, and hopefully I'll take you through a tiny bit of the empirical puzzle that led to it and some of the findings. So the standard assumption out there in the literature amongst legal scholars and political scientists is that in order to get things done, the state has to be stronger. And when we say stronger, we typically mean it needs more coercive capacity. So it needs more policing, more use of force, etc. What I have done with this project, and what I hope to convince you of, is that states are so much more than their coercive capacity. They have other tools and other capacities, and states that have limited coercive capacity can still be remarkably effective. They don't actually have to force people to to comply with the law. So this project comes out of a particular region, and as many of you know, the border between India and Nepal has always been open. It's novel in the world, and it's fantastic methodologically speaking, because for the most part, the same people live on both sides of the border. They speak the same set of languages. It's the same basic ethnic groups, speak the same, they follow the same basket of religions, etc. So this project started with an observation, and the observation was that there was really different compliance behavior on both sides of the border. So in Valmiki National Park in Bihar, in India, and in Chitwan National Park, just across the border, I observed that many people were going into Valmiki National Park and collecting fallen wood and coming out using it to heat their, cook food and heat their homes. None of that is surprising. There are a lot of people who still need firewood in order to do both of these things. What was surprising was that across the border in Nepal, they weren't doing this. And I, at least, had been accustomed to thinking of the Indian state as being quite a bit stronger than the Nepali state. The data collection for this project happened about 10 years ago, when the Nepali state was still mired in a sort of constituent assembly process and was a bit of a mess. So I was surprised to find higher compliance. This is an observational study. Now, the population density on the Nepal side of the border is actually greater than the density in India, and yet the compliance was much lower in India. So I was trying to solve this this mystery with the book. What I was trying to answer was, why do people comply with laws that run counter to both customary norms and self-interest when both states and their institutions are locally weak in this area? I was trying to figure out why Nepalis were actually complying with the law. It didn't make sense to me. Now, I looked at two other cases. I didn't just consider this environmental case. I also looked at conservation areas, but also private schools, and compliance with teacher-student ratio regulations in private schools, and compliance with child labor regulations in brick kilns. Now, as an academic, when I look at this chart, I see that Nepal is doing well in one area, India is doing well in another, and then both are doing poorly in another in the same area. That's not going to be explained by variation in state capacity, or at least coercive capacity. So I thought to myself, what is going on? Now, the literature, the academic literature, makes what many of you here will an assumption that you'll laugh at, right? The assumption is that the law is widely known and understood, that everybody simply knows what they're supposed to be doing all the time. What I argue is that this assumption is as problematical as the assumption of perfect information in economics, which was discredited and a Nobel Prize was awarded for it. In areas of state weakness, often people are not engaged in noncompliance because the state is not forcing them to do so because of coercive capacity. They simply don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Many people learn about the law not by reading about it, especially in areas where literacy is still problematical. Many people learn by watching. So they learn by observation. They watch bureaucrats, right? They watch and they try to sort of figure out who's getting into trouble for what. And then they distill this information. Sometimes it's like rumors. Sometimes it's other types of, it's conveyed in different ways. But people are constantly guessing about what the rules are. Because they learn via observation, there are ways to clarify what the rules are in an observational way, but there are other ways to do so as well. And this is just to suggest that when the state behaves inconsistently, so if bureaucrats and other state representatives do not regularly enforce regulations, people get confused. When the state behaves consistently, clarity results. Now, the idea that I put forward in the book is regulatory pragmatism. And this is an idea that suggests that bureaucrats and legislators should be responding to on-the-ground realities, creating rules that respond to people's particular situations. Now, if you are engaged in regulatory pragmatism and you recognize that people don't know what the rules are, you should be communicating them, right? That's the way to be a pragmatic regulator. What I did, and this is just a tiny portion of the project, I engaged in a field experiment in which I looked at 3 different villages. These were all in Nepal in this particular case, but the same could have been done in India. And I tried to communicate. So in one of these villages, there was no treatment at all. In a second village, I, along with another individual, went around and passed out a flyer in which legal knowledge was conveyed to people in a written form. In the third village, I conducted an interactive session with about 40 different individuals, and I had a local leader convey this information. What you see here, and you don't need to necessarily understand the statistics behind this, but what you should see is that for the local leader village at the bottom, the p-value is 0.01, which is really good. It means it's highly statistically significant. When a local leader conveyed information about the law to villagers, when I returned 6 weeks after this, different villagers knew more about the law than they did before. So this information actually can spread without reaching every single villager. You can actually collaborate between bureaucrats and legislators to provide information at the ground level, and people will change their behavior. One of the other really important parts of this project I'll go through very briefly, the remaining non-compliance that I was seeing amongst individuals on the ground in both India and Nepal related to poverty. So if you essentially outlaw people's way of life, if you say, you can't use firewood anymore to cook your food and heat your home, many people will not comply. But if you provide people with alternatives, which is a pragmatic regulatory strategy, they will in fact change their behavior. One such approach is community forestry, which is done both in India and Nepal, but was done poorly in this particular case outside of Valmiki National Park. And what I found was these are the compliance rates for those living both above and below the poverty line. As you can see, for those living above the poverty line, they're both significantly higher in Nepal than they are in India. But when individuals have access to a community forest and can access firewood from that community forest, these actually normalize. So above the poverty line and below the poverty line, when people have access to a community forest, suddenly compliance rates amongst the poor and the non-poor are very similar. I asked one last question, and I'll wrap up very briefly here. when I found this, I wanted to find out if it was just a fluke. So if this was just a one-off explanation for compliance with conservation regulations in one place. I tried looking at two different examples. I talked about them earlier: compliance with teacher-student ratio regulations and compliance with child labor regulations. So I wanted to see if it worked elsewhere. And the good news is that India did really well in terms of the Right to Education Act and compliance with teacher-student ratio regulations, which suggests to me that the basic argument that legal knowledge itself has power, no matter which country you're in, is really is efficacious. Now, when I looked at child labor regulations, where neither the Indian state nor the Nepali state has done anything pragmatic to try to reduce this, I found that essentially the compliance was the same in both places. All of this suggests that the argument is generalizable, that this is something that can be applied elsewhere in India and elsewhere in the world. I've received a large grant from the US government recently, and this is something that I'm actually quite proud of, to use an idea that I figured out in India and Nepal to actually increase regulatory compliance in the US. So I've taken this idea and I'm working on building code compliance with respect to storms and earthquakes in Alaska and Puerto Rico. And it's an idea that came from India and Nepal and is now being used in the US. So I'll leave it at that for the most part and open the floor to greater discussion.